My interest in Korean cinema, as Mark has mentioned, began about 7 years ago when I was researching my dissertation, which, as he said, was about mostly Hollywood remakes of foreign films. So at the time, in the early 2000s, of course, Korean cinema appeared as the latest new wave in the history of world cinema due to its massive success festivals, gaining theatrical distribution in the United States. I saw a number of these films in theaters in Los Angeles. And then, of course, outperforming Hollywood films in the domestic box office. Right, so this is a national cinema that is legitimate within its own domestic market. And so, consequently, at the time, Hollywood producers did what they often do, and that is buy the remake rights to many of these films as a kind of intellectual property speculation. And I staged a preemptive strike of my own, devouring many of these Korean films, waiting to see, like looking at them saying, okay, what's going on here that is probably going to have to change for Hollywood? However, only a limited number of these remakes ever came to fruition. The remake for Oldboy, for instance, is still in the works today after 8 years of development. It hasn't been made. So although I did not focus much on Korean cinema in my dissertation, I was left with a deep appreciation for these films, and I've made some broad observations about them. So my talk today is titled Feeling for History, and it pertains to one of these general tendencies I've seen across many different genres of Korean cinema. Specifically, a number of films that create these interesting links between film form, affect, and history, or at least temporality. So for all that Korean cinema seems to the outsider, like myself, like a recent phenomenon, the cinema itself is obsessed, it seems, with pastness itself, with the past. Through the use of particular narratives and narrative devices, a great number of Korean films place a heavy burden on the past as a means of explaining the present. So although my talk today will focus on the use of flashbacks and similar nonlinear plot devices, there are also films that use time travel, and I'll talk about those, and the film Peppermint Candy notably told its story in reverse chronological order. So over the course of this talk, the general argument is that there's this tendency, this pastness, this obsession, is a kind of artistic expression, gives artistic creative form to experiential modes of history through the use of these narrative structures. So before I delve into this analysis, I'm compelled to provide some admissions and explanations about what I'm up to. More than simple caveats, though, I hope that these points will help propel the discussion. First and foremost, I am not a specialist in Korean cinema, and I'm not an expert in Korean culture. I do not speak the language, and I have yet to visit the country. The assertions I make today, therefore, must be taken for what they are, notes and suggestions by someone who has watched a lot of movies and noticed some commonalities and sought to explain them. Further, my position as cultural outsider to these films and their context should warn me anyway, against taking them as symptomatic of some specifically Korean cultural or psychological disposition. Although the object of my analysis is Korean cinema, it is not my intention to make claims about Korean national cinema in particular, as it is quite possible that similar patterns emerge in different historical and cultural contexts. Here again, I think of my indebtedness to Johannes's work about German film, and most recently an essay about the Hitler film Downfall, where he talks, there's a chapter section called Feeling for History, which I plagiarized here. So, if I suggest today that these films suggest a structure of feeling regarding the past, specifically a feeling for history, or of taking history as a feeling or as a set of sensations, then I don't propose that this serves as a psychological diagnosis for real-world South Korean social subjects. It is a pattern in the films, in the visual material culture of South Korea. Put simply, my goal is not to simply align text with context, as I take it that the film texts are part of any kind of cultural context. However, I do claim that these odd temporalities are significant. I suggest that they dramatize crises between individual subjectivity and social change, specifically by highlighting traumatic experiences with time. These films present indirect creative historiographies, and that's a point that I'm going to parse out later between history and historiography. This seems particularly important in the context of official characterizations of contemporary South Korea, which often, these histories often highlight the incredible rate of social change that the nation underwent over a short period of time, this kind of rapid modernity. Bruce Cummings, the absolutely amazing historian who has humbled me by being part of this lecture series earlier this semester, has written, quote, "Korea could not establish its own constructions of the past due to its subjugation to imperialism in the past century." He further states that, well, not yet. Quote, "Contemporary Koreans in North and South think they have escaped history and tradition in the dizzying pace of an energetic 20th century. Things are different now in South Korea, of course, with the ending of colonization, the arrival of democracy, and an relatively open approach toward globalization. in light of these shifts, Cumming writes that going to Korea as of the 1990s is, quote, to encounter a past and a future that intermingle promiscuously. Such statements situate South Korea as a culture that, due to a fractured and spatially divergent experience of modernity, presents serious historiographical challenges. Different times overlap and coexist. In some cases, the rapid rate of social change during the last several decades has had actually a direct bearing on historiographical method itself. Here I'm thinking of the later editions of the book, A History of Contemporary Korea by Kang Mang-gil. Whereas earlier editions had to downplay the role of socialist groups during the colonial period, the author was able to discuss these elements after democratic reforms occurred in the late 1980s and early 1990s. In this respect, the issue is not just that social changes impact a cultural disposition, but further that historical contexts impact historiographical method itself. And I would suggest that this also impacts the historical impulses of Korean films. So, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about a lot of things, a lot of movies. For the rest of this talk, I'll be detailing these historical impulses and these creative historiographical methods. I'll begin by providing some counterexamples to my argument. Second, I will contend with the film Peppermint Candy, which it rightfully garnered widespread acclaim and academic attention due to its ingenious way of using narrative structure to dramatize Korean social history. Third, I will briefly discuss the so-called time travel melodramas that appeared in the early 2000s, with an emphasis on Mare, as these films also prompted scholars and critics to read film narratives in relation to Korean politics and society. I will then talk about the widespread diffusion of flashbacks in Korean cinema, all pointing toward, eventually, a discussion of the Vengeance Trilogy, which actually I've written an essay about, and which the thesis of that essay is actually in opposition to some of the things I'm saying here today. So, there are, of course, many ways that films deal with history without toying with narrative structure or creating odd temporalities. Perhaps the simplest way to do this is just by setting their narratives, whoa, interesting, okay, in a distinct earlier historical period. And indeed, there are a number of recent films that are period pieces. More often than not, these films work within the dominant mindset about culture and identity as a means of reframing their vision of past events or the past society. Among these, I would count Im Kwon-taek's Chunyang, as well as Untold Scandal, which is the blurry image right there. Whereas Chunyang is derived from a pansori folktale and has been made as a film many times over the course of the last 80 years. The most recent version is notable for providing the lush mise-en-scène and antiquated clothing typical of period pieces. And it makes an overt claim to a specifically Korean cultural identity through providing pansori bookends to the film, so the singing happens before and after the kind of staging of the film itself. Somewhat differently, Untold Scandal is a faithful adaptation of Dangerous Liaisons, made in 2003. The film, however, is set in 18th century Korea, and again features lavish costumes and decor, and is stately in its compositions and straightforward in its narratives. In addition to the Western source of the story, there's also several ways that the film blends Western and Korean traditions, including the use of Western chamber music throughout its soundtrack, as well as various references to Catholicism, which of course was occurring at the time. There are also a number of recent films that take a look at Korean social history from the more recent past. Here I'm thinking of The President's Last Bang and May 18th, among others. What's interesting about these two films is their direct, overt interest in dramatizing politically tumultuous events that have occurred recently, these are events which many historians have cited as central to the problematic history of Korean democracy in general. The mere existence of these films might be taken as indications of a loosening of political censorship, as indications that the injustices of the past have become topics for open discourse. The fact that these films turn what had been painful historical events into entertainment that indicates to me that social history has become integrated to some degree within the general idiom of popular visual culture in South Korea. I want to skip over this quickly. I also just wanted to mention that there's these films that occur every once in a while that are overtly Buddhist in their themes and stories, which the main goal of them is to kind of connect human conditions to the natural world and provide a vision of recycling, so that there actually is very little, almost no social change whatsoever. So these films are anti-historical, and they make these oblique gestures toward the modern world, right, where things changed or fast-paced. But within their narratives, it's about these young monks learning the universal truths of the elder monks, and so they become this endless recycling of the same. This couldn't be more different than Peppermint Candy. This film, like Memento and Irreversible before it. It's an international art film that features a backwards narrative. The plot primarily obeys a reverse chronological structure, leaving viewers to reassemble the story into chronological order as an after effect. Like Memento and Irreversible, Peppermint Candy asks viewers, how did things come to be this way? Will the past explain the present, and if so, how? However, unlike these films, Peppermint Candy directly contends with an individual's relation to political history. One sequence in the film depicts the protagonist as he begins his career as a police officer and is prompted by fellow officers to torture a left-leaning political dissident. In another sequence, taking place earlier but later, details how the protagonist took part in the violent quelling of a student protest as part of his military service in 1980. In the end, that is, at the beginning of the film, the man is overwhelmed by his past and commits suicide. Oh, I need to mention this. I give a lot of spoilers throughout this talk. Like, it's terrible. So if you haven't seen them, maybe you'll forget, because it's all about memory anyway. I'm really sorry. In the end, the man is overwhelmed by his past and commits suicide. The ruptures in political history cause an irreconcilable rupture in the man's psyche. Because of its innovative treatment of narrative structure, as well as the interesting connections it makes between personal subjectivity and social history, this film has garnered much attention from film scholars. Todd McGowan has read the film through a psychoanalytic lens, but a historical one, and argues that, quote, the film uses reverse chronology to depict the recurrence of a failure and thus to undermine the spectator's attachment to nation as a foundation for identity. Somewhat similarly, Steve Cho has argued that the film synthesizes the history of the protagonist with that of South Korea and points toward the frailty of both. He differs in his analysis, however, in seeing that each of the film's sequences is indicating an inevitable progress toward a cataclysmic end, born of a specific originary trauma. Whether understanding the film is progressive or not, however, both these scholars make strong links between the protagonist's experiences and those of the nation, and both read the narrative of the film as commenting on social historiography itself. Based on this, I would suggest that both these authors demonstrate a desire for history, and a desire for a particular kind of history. There is no question that the film invokes particular moments in Korea's recent political history and situates the protagonist in relationship to them, nor is there any question that its novel narrative structure requires a kind of interesting form of interpretation among its audiences. It seems to me, however, that just as much as the film may elicit new understandings about the relationship between the individual to large-scale social changes, scholarship about this film shows an analogous desire to link film form, narrative structure, and story itself to political and social events in South Korea. That is, if the film demonstrates a linkage between individual and community, these scholars demonstrate a desire for a link between aesthetics and politics. This issue becomes even more pronounced with a number of films that use time travel as the means of investigating the relation between the past and the present. This genre of time travel melodramas was identified by Anthony Leung, and he calls it the love across time genre. And he posits that it's distinct to Korean cinema. He just says offhand almost, the genre mixes melodrama with elements of science fiction to tell stories about lovers who overcome being separated in time to be united in this kind of sometimes mystical way. I'll describe it. So examples include the ginkgo bed, in which reincarnated but time-separated lovers get to meet in a magical bed. So they're otherwise separated, but at this bed, it's outside of time. And then there's the film Ditto, in which a couple living in different eras, about 20 years apart, contact one another through a ham radio. I'm most familiar with the film Mare because it was remade by Hollywood as The Lake House. I don't recommend it. Mare tells the story of a man and a woman who live in a house by the sea, literally on the sea. Although they live in the same place, they occupy it 2 years apart. This man and this woman begin exchanging letters to one another via the house's mailbox, which seems to exist outside of historical time. Over the course of the film, the couple develops romantic feelings for one another, and although they try to meet, their efforts fail. In the end, the woman warns the man not to go to a meeting he has in the city because he will be hit by a car. But the concluding shots of the film reveal that, in fact, he did not go to the meeting. Although he lives, and although the couple finally meet one another in the same place and at the same time, the man has no memory of the correspondence with the woman due to the paradox that they've created. The future is open to them together as a couple, but without their shared past. It is enticing to read these films, particularly their structure, as part of a larger culturally specific treatment of time in contemporary Korean cinema. The narrative device of time travel allows for a dramatic conflation of temporalities, and thus could evoke disparate and confusing experiences of time occurring in the social realm. And indeed, film scholar David Martin Jones has argued that time travel melodramas are relatively direct reactions to contemporary political and economic conditions, saying that these narratives ruminate on the past and attempt to explain the causes for these different experiences of time and history. He argues that the genre provides a means of unpacking the intense rate of social change occurring over the last 50 years. Further, he states, such a reflective approach to storytelling is only possible in the aftermath of the IMF crisis, when these two films in particular came out. So he's saying these films think about history, but they're so specific in this 3-year period that this moment was the moment to reflect on history in this way. He says, quote, these films take advantage of a brief pause in economic development caused by the IMF crisis and use time travel narratives to create a reflective space in which to relive recent history. I'm not disputing this interpretation of these films, but I do want to highlight how much Martin Jones wants to link these films to the political and economic context in which they were released. Truth be told, these films only make indirect references to the historical conditions within their diegetic worlds. Unlike something like May 18th or even Peppermint Candy, the time travel melodramas generally are not interested in political topics within their narratives. Instead, they reflect all questions of time and history entirely through the heart, through the emotions, and through the psyches of their characters, deferring almost completely any questions of history as a social practice. They are melodramas. This is not to suggest that David Martin Jones neglects the fact that these films are melodramas, as in fact he does discuss this point. Yet he is insistent in reading these films as political reactions or as reactions to politics, while simultaneously neglecting the role of affect within the narratives. The plot of Mare, like the genre more generally, does not make any direct reference to political events. But the film does demonstrate the force of human will in attempting to come to synthesize moments, disparate moments in time. In fact, at the conclusion of Mare, the protagonist must sacrifice his memory in order to collapse these two different times. If we are to read this allegorically, or as standing in for a larger cultural disposition, then it suggests that the internal clock of the heart and that of the external world cannot be synthesized. It seems that this is exactly this separation which facilitates and perhaps even prompts interpretations like that of David Martin Jones. If the films cannot make the linkage between text and context, then it becomes the desire of the scholar to do so. To be clear, I do not mean to discount these readings. Instead, I want to emphasize the degree to which these films are only indirectly political and more overtly play to the heart of their audiences by dramatizing issues of the heart among their characters. I would suggest that if these films are about history and historical experience, then they take history, or at the minimum, a confusing sense of time, as primarily occurring in the realm of affect and emotion. The characters themselves almost never think about the logical problems of their temporal situations. Instead, time serves as the ground upon which their emotional dramas play out. In other words, if these films are about history, then they take history and turn it into a drama of the heart, make history a set of feelings. They present a feeling for history. Time travel and backwards narratives are some of the most remarkable ways that time gets disrupted in Korean cinema. But this tendency for temporal shifting is apparent in the near ubiquity of the flashback. When I was first immersing myself in Korean cinema with an eye toward how these films might be changed in the Hollywood remake, the rampant use of flashbacks was what stood out the most. And perhaps it is no surprise that I locked onto this element. Without a knowledge of the language or of cultural norms and nuances, I was perhaps most attentive to issues of film form and of narrative structure. For the most part, contemporary Korean popular films do maintain a classical narrative design with psychologically defined, motivated characters, as well as plots that generally obey a cause and effect linkage of events. But flashbacks are everywhere, in almost every genre. I think the only exception really is romantic comedies, which are vehemently set in the present. And so their pervasiveness, their diffusion across genres, makes them a salient touchstone for investigating how time and the heart, affect, intermix within this cinema. This diffusion and seeming naturalness of flashbacks in Korean cinema are, in fact, what the reasons why I find them so useful for thinking about this idea about feeling for history. In her extensive analysis of flashbacks, Maureen Tarim has indicated that flashbacks can intertwine memory and history. Although she primarily discusses representations of social history, she nevertheless indicates how the representation of personal memories in flashbacks can implicate subject-centered ideologies of history itself, that is, like kind of semi-narcissistic visions of like how the world changes. In this manner, according to her, the flashback renders history as a, quote, individual and emotional experience. This is particularly important to my argument, as it indicates that the use of flashbacks is not merely a way of using individual characters to stand in for larger social communities, but further, and more to the point, that the flashback renders historical thinking as an emotional experience. Indeed, we might think of these films, or at least the characters within them, as not displaying much historical consciousness, but more of a temporal awareness. Not quite a historical unconsciousness either, but more a feeling for time's passage. Flashbacks occur in Korean films for a variety of purposes and have varying levels of impact upon their narratives. Some of the films have flashbacks, some of these films flashbacks are almost incidental, as they play a relatively minor role in the larger narrative. Here I'm thinking of Memories of Murder, which has a very typical it's a police procedural where the guy remembers a detail about the investigation and thus allows him to solve it. Similarly, in the cop drama Public Enemy, there's a short flashback toward the end of the film where the cop remembers a detail about the murder, and this allows him to confront the proper criminal. Perhaps more interesting is Taegukgi, which is the a melodrama about a family torn apart by the Korean War, and much in the vein of something like Saving Private Ryan. The film begins with an old man being called by these people who are excavating bones that they find from the war and saying, "Are you dead?" And he says, "No, I'm alive." And he said, "Well, we think we found you dead in the ditch." And then the film proceeds to go back in time and show how this family is torn apart by the war, and then the film concludes. It's all right. It's not me, so. This time, I'm not following you. But the film concludes with him standing at the ditch, and it turns out that the bones are those of his brother, and the grandfather is weeping, and his granddaughter's, standing there by him, and it's this nice kind of bookend. It's one of those kind of flashbacks that, say, "Let me tell you a story." Then the film tells the story, and then it says, "That was the story," and then we cry. If those examples provide simple narrative information or justification, then other examples demonstrate how the flashback is integral to a number of other kinds of stories. A lot of these, actually, and this is something I'll discuss, are really interested in feminine sexuality or just feminine identity in general. So simple examples include My Wife is a Gangster, where a series of flashbacks early in the film show how violent and callous the female protagonist has been, and this heightens the comic effect of her behavior in the rest of the film when she has to be a submissive housewife, essentially. More interesting is 301, 302, which details a relationship between female narratives, both of whom have traumatic experiences in their respective pasts, and which are depicted in a number of really extended flashbacks. This film is really difficult to follow in terms of where does fantasy and memory begin and end, and when are we? At the end of the film, one of the women chops the other up, prepares her as a meal, and eats her. So if the radical nonlinearity in 301, 302 serves as a metaphor for the unstable psyches of its characters, then this alignment between film form and feminine psyche becomes a general condition in a number of horror films from the late 1990s and early 2000s, including such films as Whispering Corridors, its pseudo-remake Memento Mori, Ring Virus, Phone, and A Tale of Two Sisters. In all of these cases, flashbacks are used to uncover traumatic events in the past of the characters as a means of explaining why things are bad in the present and explaining why the characters continue to struggle with their emotions. That is, the flashbacks at once provide a rational explanation for the supernatural events within the films and simultaneously connect the events of the past to the present as a single and continuous experience of suffering. In some cases, such as with Phone and Ring Virus, the flashback occurs in a relatively orderly manner and creates a clear connection between past and present. In other cases, such as with Memento Mori and A Tale of Two Sisters, the order, frequency, and point of view of the flashbacks actually undermines any logical understanding of how the past and the present interrelate. Indeed, in many moments in these films, the past and the present are difficult to differentiate, creating a general mood of temporal uneasiness. Not when are we, or is the ghost in the closet, but rather not where are we, where is the ghost, but when are we, when is the ghost? In all of these films, the issues of injustice and emotional suffering are linked to the sexual identities of young women. Both Whispering Corridors and Memento Mori are set in a high school where the all-female student population is forced to endure the hardships of their teachers. Notably, in both films, vengeful female ghosts kill off the unjust male teachers who harass the young women. In the earlier film, there's the suggestion that several of the teenage schoolgirls are troubled by romantic feelings they have for one another. The suggestion of homosexuality is made overt in Memento Mori, which depicts a young lesbian couple as its main characters. In both these films, feelings of homosexual desire seem almost contagious, as in several cases, young women in the film films develop a relationship with one another as an echo of a previous lesbian relationship had by other students. Here, the characters are both literally and figuratively possessed by feelings of desire, and it's these feelings which engender the eruption of the past into the present. Although these ghost stories do not deal with social or political events directly, they remain interested in issues of power, justice, knowledge, and desire. Without exception, these films intertwine these themes with a concern for time and temporality. It seems that there is simply little way to think about power, justice, knowledge, and desire in these films without thinking about time. Consequently, it does not seem a big leap to read these films as metaphoric or allegorical expressions of historical questions about power, justice, and knowledge. However, these films equally indicate that we cannot do so without contending with the role of desire, with the role of trauma, or of affect more generally. So that was the broad view. As a way of refining these ideas and making them more concrete, I'll spend the rest of this talk talking about time, temporality, affect, and flashbacks in the Vengeance Trilogy by Pak Chan-wook. It's comprised of Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Oldboy, and Sympathy for Lady Vengeance. Not only do these films dramatize issues with time and affect in important ways, but their very composition as a trilogy marks their importance in thinking about the role of time and history in Korean cinema. There are many kinds of trilogies, of course. There are those like the Oedipus cycle, which are kind of seen as a trilogy as an after effect. They were written independently of one another, and later critics and publishers put them together. Or there's something like Oresteia by Aeschylus, which absolutely connects three plays together as one insoluble unit. The point being that trilogies are always a multiplicity. As a multiplicity, however, trilogies form a unity, a narrative unity out of three parts. Narrative is the determinant criterion as it distinguishes the trilogy from the triptych, the triangle, or any other unit based on three. The trilogy follows a narrative logic, a tri-logic that seeks unity and completion in the number three. As an elaboration of a narrative or of a theme, the trilogy resembles certain forms of logic through its play with various terms, that is, three terms, a tri-logos. Whether comprised of films of a continuing narrative or films that contribute to a binding theme, all trilogies must have three parts. No more, no fewer. Thus, in its specific process of complicating and resolving a theme or a set of concerns or formal terms, the trilogy seeks a limit, a terminus. It must end, must be multiple and singular in a singularly triadic way. A dual character thus becomes apparent. The trilogy at once raises issues of thematic extension and elaboration with those of delimitation and duration. Pak Chan-wook's Vengeance Trilogy mobilizes this condition of the film trilogy towards particular conceptual and cultural ends. Specifically, these films explicate issues of history and justice in every one. Each of these films, but particularly Oldboy and Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, deal with characters who experience historical erasures and whose desire for personal justice coincides with an attempt to resolve their present conditions with their past histories, to recover lost time. In this regard, the thematic term of the trilogy, vengeance, likewise resonates with issues of temporal delimitation and discrete historical periods, or terms, in a dialectical play. In its creative treatment of these problems, the Vengeance Trilogy does not continue a narrative line among its parts. Characters in one film do not appear in the others, and in fact, a number of the same actors appear in different roles in each of the three films. Rather, it connects these three films through telling different stories that contribute to the theme of vengeance. In doing so, the trilogy forsakes the internal logic of temporal continuation to pose a set of ideas about time, process, continuity, and discontinuity. This abstracted approach toward time also points toward the theme of the trilogy, vengeance, which has a duality all of its own. Vengeance is always a revenge, a response in kind to some previous action. One cannot begin with vengeance. Of necessity, vengeance is determined from without, determined in advance, making vengeance secondary, anterior, and delayed. It makes no sense to say someone had their vengeance at the same time they were harmed. Time is of the essence. On the spirit of vengeance, Nietzsche, of course, says, "Indeed, this alone is what revenge is, the will's ill will against time and time's it was." An ethics of justice in time is an ethics toward time, toward a feeling for time and time's immobility. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance suggests a crisis in time that would become central concerns in Oldboy and Sympathy for Lady Vengeance. The protagonist, Ryu, is a deaf and dumb man who is scraped together to pay for, here again with the spoilers, sorry. He's scraped together enough money to pay for his younger sister's desperately needed kidney transplant. However, the two must wait for a matching donor while she suffers. In this respect, the film initiates a temporality of mortal crisis that is intertwined with the force of capitalism. It is precisely capitalism's rhythm to which Ryu must adhere, and incidentally, to which his disability impairs him. A scene early in the film depicts him working under strenuous conditions in an industrial factory. When the horn blows and signals the end of the working shift, Ryu does not hear it and does not exit with the other workers. When it blows again, he continues his work alongside the new crew. He labors beyond the strictures of the factory clock as a result of both his desire and of his physical condition. He works longer than the others to make money to extend his sister's life, to buy her time. But things go badly. After getting swindled by black market organ dealers, Ryu and his girlfriend engage in a kidnapping scheme to get money to pay for a legally obtained kidney, a temporary holding of a body with the aim of obtaining a body part. Due to happenstance and accident, however, this plan results in the death of Ryu's sister and the death of their kidnapped victim, the daughter of a rich capitalist named Park Dong-jin, who's there. Ryu kills the organ dealers, and Park kills Ryu's girlfriend. From here, Ryu and the businessman Park extricate themselves from the rhythm of economic production and dedicate themselves wholly to the pursuit of revenge. They enter into a new tempo, a new temporality of strategic intervals between their respective acts of brutality. Rather than the constant and consistent forward movement of action in time, of clocks, and of the market, the characters' actions are intermittent, pulsing. The rhythm of the film conforms to this, languidly detailing the antagonist's alternation between strategy and brutality. After breaking into Ryu's apartment, Park sits and waits for him to return. The film cuts to Ryu sitting inside a car, waiting outside Park's apartment building. The film emphasizes the physical element of the delayed tempo by showing Ryu drink a bottle of water, and then in the next shot, set the bottle down outside his car, and it's now filled with urine. Night falls, and Park is still in the apartment, and the film cuts from Park stretching his neck in exhaustion to Ryu doing the same thing in his car. The spirit of revenge may be inexhaustible, but people are not, it seems, and eventually Ryu returns home only to be rendered unconscious by the waiting antagonist, who does not kill him right away, but rather takes him to the place where his daughter drowned and causes him to drown as well. In a concluding eruption of violence, however, radical leftists with whom Ryu's girlfriend implausibly claimed affiliation show up at the river and kill him. Here, the film makes overt its dramatic tension between biological time, that is mortality, and the disciplinary force of factory time and capitalism more generally. Everyone involved dies, as there is always an excess of revenge, a growth economy. Oldboy follows Mr. Vengeance logically complicates the previous film's connection between revenge and time. It is with this film that the Vengeance Trilogy enters into a mode of narration that I like to call, or that I am calling, historical narration. I'm using this term narration following the formalist theorist Gerard Genette to describe, quote, the event that consists of someone recounting something, the act of narrating itself. It is the producing narrative action and the whole of the action that takes place within it. In this last respect, narration functions both for the act of narration within the text as well as the text itself narrating itself. Thus, by historical narration, I mean a narrational mode that contends with the passage of time in relationship to something like social change or the collective practice, social practice of time. I propose that this historical narration articulates, to some degree, texts with social history, to the extent that they present creative attempts at coming to terms, perhaps even new or dialectical third terms, with otherwise problematic constructions of history in their respective social arenas. Once again, I have to emphasize that I don't seek to link the films with Korean history per se. Instead, I'm asserting that they offer historiographical questions in their own right. How do you write the relationship between what happened and what's happening? In its formal construction, Park's previous film, JSA, Joint Security Area, anticipated some of these tactics used in the Vengeance films. The film explores issues related to the division between North and South Korea in explicit terms and frames a male melodrama in the demilitarized zone through a Rashomon-esque whodunit. The film engages in an elaborate flashback structure that reveals the truth of the past to its viewers but simultaneously obfuscates this truth from its characters. In this respect, JSA uses narrative construction to gesture toward problematic constructions of political history. Oldboy and Sympathy for Lady Vengeance use narrative techniques somewhat similarly, although they do not really take up political issues in any kind of overt way. First, excuse me, they maintain that the meaning of the present conditions can only be found in the past, that meaning can only be found in the past. Second, they represent crises affecting the ability to recount history in an unproblematic way. In doing so, the films and their mode of historical narration resembles what Homi Bhabha has called the writing of the nation, or the nation as a narrative strategy. Bhabha has written that in this kind of mode of narration, the telling of the story of the nation, it's punctuated by a dual temporality caught between a mythologized origin and a performative present. Such narratives articulate the conceptual ambivalence of modernity through a, quote, a process of splitting. So what this kind of origin, this mythological origin, and then what we make of the nation now splits us as national subjects. This effect can be rendered in diverse ways, although several narrational techniques are used with distinctive force in Oldboy and Lady Vengeance. First, they narrate the theft of time of the protagonists, leaving these agents displaced in an alternative historical moment where they must catch up. Second, these films use flashbacks as a means of locating the supposed cause of their stories. Third, and somewhat related to this, these texts have intricate chronological sequences. Although frequently subtle, this play of sequence can also be an area of the most profound temporal splittings, the means by which these films question the stability of the historical past and the ability to recount it in a singular way. This is the film's ground for articulating contradictions in time. So it is with Oldboy. From the start, before it starts, it holds a contradiction of temporality. Old boy. Aged but immature, matured too quickly. Here, a cycle of reciprocal revenges begins with a vengeance taken in time, as the protagonist, Odesu, is mysteriously kidnapped and held in a private prison for 15 years. Time is the technology of vengeance here. Odesu spends these years sleeping, watching television, and punching the walls. After some time, he assumes he is being punished, but he doesn't know what he did wrong or to whom, so he writes a record of all his sins and all of his victims. He is released as suddenly and as inexplicably as he was captured. He partners with an attractive young woman and searches for his prisoner so that he might exact some unkindness in kind for the theft of his time. Yet, when he finds the villain, it is not enough to harm him, as Odesu must find out why he was imprisoned, why imprisonment was the appropriate punishment, and why 15 years was the term of his internment. He wants to retrieve his story, and it is inside him, but forgotten or perhaps repressed. And it is brought to the surface of the film in the form of a flashback. In this flashback, he runs beside himself within the story. Literally in the film, if there were one clip I was going to show, it would be this, where like literally the old Odesu is running around watching the young Odesu kind of have this moment where he witnesses a young man and a young woman, brother and sister, have an incestual relationship inside a high school room. So in this moment, in the search for the past, he re-enters it, but different this time, multiplying himself in a process of splitting that recalls Bhabha's double time of the nation. The film narrates at least two dualities within this flashback, a duality of protagonists and a duality of narrations, one for the protagonist and one for us, the audience. Odesu watches his younger self witness this incestual affair, and then he lets the secret slip. But he moves to a new high school before he can see the disastrous results. After all the school learns of this incest, the Woojin, the man, his sister kills herself from the shame. The use of flashback in Oldboy most resembles, oh, and I wanted to mention, this kind of person remembering within the memory. The only place that I can think of this offhand is otherwise occurring is in the film Spider, which is a great film by David Cronenberg, where he watches himself as a young child. Interesting approach toward mise-en-scène in memory. This use of flashback in Oldboy most resembles Maureen Tarim's observations regarding psychological melodrama and film noir, as it binds a flashback structure to the psyche and yet is used for an investigation and a confession. Yet even this individualized investigation of the past positions Oldboy as a creative rendering of historiographical troubles. The film makes a point of indicating the specific era during which Odesu is imprisoned, from 1988 to 2003. Although cut off from society, Odesu watches on television as President Roo Moo-hyun is convicted of bribery in 1996. President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean President Kim Jong-il meet for the first time in 2000. So although it links him to history, it's also interesting to me that this is via television. So although, like, at the same time that I'm arguing that these films are presenting creative historiographies, it's interesting to me that the character within it only gets a sense of historical change via a screen, like maybe we do. In other words, Odesu is imprisoned during a period in which South Korea underwent radical social transformations. It is tempting to read the film's flashback structure as the personalized counterpart to his historical erasure and social alienation. To catch up with society requires that he go back, subjectively, and in this way the flashback inverts the temporality of the imprisonment, as well as, in this reading, the relation between social history and personal memory. Interpreted this way, the narrative mode of Oldboy largely conforms with Frederick Jameson's description of a national allegory. In such texts, Jameson asserts, the story, quote, the story of the private individual destiny is always an allegory for an embattled situation of the public third world culture or society. Moreover, Jameson suggests that in such texts, quote, the psychology, or more specifically, libidinal investment, is to be read in political and social terms. This reading strategy contrasts with the typical relation between society and psychology created in so-called first world texts, where, in general, quote, political commitment is recontained and psychologized and even subjectivized. Of course, this interpretive strategy has been critiqued many times, and Ijaz Ahmad's critique is just one of the most clear and poignant. As Ahmad indicates, Jameson's formulation is, quote, centrally grounded on a binary opposition between first and third world, and partly as a result of this, Jameson essentializes third world nations, peoples, experiences, and texts, a good portion of the population of the planet. One might remember that at the time Oldboy was made, South Korea was not a third world nation. Nevertheless, we still might read Oldboy as a national allegory precisely because it allegorizes the confusingly rapid rate of social transformation in the nation during the latter part of the 20th century. In this respect, the film would serve as an emblem for the ambivalent stance South Korea might hold between first and third worlds in terms of the rate of modernity. But it also seems that Jameson's formulation facilitates, not finishing quite yet, although I'm getting close. But it also seems that Jameson's formulation facilitates the kind of politically driven textual analysis of which I've become somewhat wary. If scholars and critics neatly line up one film or one book or any other text, and transcode it seamlessly with a timeline of important political events in a country, we do risk neglecting the role of affect within these narratives and the potential sites of effective relation between the text and their audiences. Looking back at Oldboy, we see that psychological libidinal drives and social political impulses get displaced and rearranged to devastating effect. In his adventure to seek out and confront Woo Jin for imprisoning him, Odesu falls in love with his female companion. Spoiler alert. The romance is at first awkward and comical, but eventually the film depicts the culmination of their feelings in an extensive lovemaking scene. In the final confrontation with Woo Jin, however, Odesu is told that the girl is his daughter. Rough. Woo Jin displaces his own ancestral taboo into his adversary, taking revenge for the loss of his love by engendering his perverted libido into another. Woo Jin's ultimate threat is to tell the daughter, who is held captive at another location. In an act that conjoins his desires as a lover and as a protective father, Odesu severs his wayward tongue in reparation for his sin. Having thus completed his goal of devastating Odesu, and in time and in creating a trauma that cannot be undone, Woo Jin kills himself. After all the violence and mayhem, however, Oldboy concludes with Odesu erasing the knowledge of the incestual affair, allowing it to continue into the future without a guilty conscience. With the aid of a hypnotist, he literally splits his consciousness, placing his desire into his unconscious, suppressing it and repressing it. As Marx has written, quote, the phantoms formed in the brain of men are also necessarily sublimates of their material life. Thus a new temporality comes about, an erasure that opens to the future, which sublates the contradiction between social history and personal psychology held within this old boy. Getting close. This extremely unstable relation also opens up to sympathy for Lady Vengeance, a third remark on the spirit of revenge. Is sympathy for Mr. Vengeance depicted the contradiction between time of commerce and the time of revenge, between market and practice? And if Oldboy expounded upon this tension through a collision of social history with the personal and snarled memory, then sympathy for Lady Vengeance further complicates these terms. As the third entry into the trilogy, it closes as it opens, sets a final term for a discourse, but likewise implicates the multiplicity of vengeance itself, and thus the relative arbitrariness of any terminus. Indeed, the film is largely about dealing with collective vengeance. What would collective vengeance entail? For Lady Vengeance, it starts with another historical erasure and another imprisonment. Yet this imprisonment is of another, one who is imprisoned in place of another. The film begins with the protagonist, Lee Gum-ja, who's as she exits prison after serving her sentence. The plot then alternates between her showing her working toward her vengeance and her backstory, which explains how she was wrongfully imprisoned for 13 years. These flashbacks show that she went to prison for the murder of a little boy, yet they also show that she never murdered the little boy, but was rather blackmailed into a false confession by a serial killer who had threatened her own daughter. Good melodrama stuff. Hers is a displaced imprisonment, a double theft of time, unveiled through the nonlinear double time of the narrative exposition. In some cases, these flashbacks describe how things came to be as they are, such as when Lee mimes the murder of the boy in order to prove her guilt. Other moments demonstrate some aspect of her disposition, such as when her capacity for violence is shown by her poisoning the prison bully for harassing another inmate. All of these flashbacks illuminate the truth of the contemporary situation. As in Oldboy, the narrative here only makes sense in relationship to earlier events. Unlike Oldboy, however, these flashbacks are not presented as memories. The past is not forgotten and in need of retrieval. Instead, the past is recognized, making the temporal splittings an experience for the film's audience, but not for her. This difference suggests that the logic of historical narration has moved from inside out, from the protagonist of Oldboy to the viewer of Sympathy for Lady Vengeance. Once released, Lee Gum-ja reconnects with her past inmates to collect favors needed for her revenge. In this, Lady Vengeance depicts a social collectivity of women who have been secluded from society, from social historical development. It is a society of time served, of time paid. Although thrown together by happenstance, the film shows how they form bonds. For instance, when Lee visits a former cellmate who is imprisoned for killing her pimp, the woman, who has since become a hairstylist, hugs Lee Gum-ja deeply and weeps. The film also shows how kind and helpful Lee was to this woman in prison. Similarly, the film shows how Lee gives a kidney to a fellow prisoner whose kidneys have failed and so gained her trust and love. As she recollects and recollects these relations, they all remark that she is different now than she was in prison. And indeed, whereas in prison Lee appeared generous and caring to those around her, even angelic, she appears distant and even uncaring after being released. Yet the bonds forged in the past hold, and the women help Lee in her mission to get revenge. The singular vengeance of Lee Gum-ja mobilizes an entire collective, making it partly their revenge as well. The film then inverts the logic of this part-whole relation. In searching down and kidnapping Mr. Baek, who's the man who actually killed the little boy, Lee discovers that there were multiple victims, that Mr. Baek was a serial killer. He kept multiple mementos of his victims. With the help of an approval of a police detective, Lee searches out the families of the 4 additional children who were killed by the villain. As the family members watch videos of the children being tortured and killed, historical recordings, the film intercuts brief flash-forward images of these people violently attacking Mr. Baek. They will enact revenge for their past in the future. But Lee offers the family members a choice. They can turn Baek over to the police, or they can enact a speedier, personalized justice of their own. They debate. Some do not want to make a decision at all. Some claim that anyone who wants to kill him can, and others who don't want to do it don't have to. A democratic, collective solution to murder. They vote. The minority who vote not to kill him nevertheless get pulled into the majority, now part of a communal act of violence. A new, spontaneous, representative democracy is formed out of past trauma. They decide that only one member of each grieving family must represent that family by attacking the villain. Collective but individuated, they line up and enter the killing room and wound the villain. Common purpose, similar actions, one at a time. The pace of the film notably slows during this last movement, laboring over both the political formation developed by this group as well as their acts of violence. It goes on and on. Lee's loss of 13 years and the loss of the children's lives get transfigured into a cinematic luxuriating in tempo, a measured, beautiful, and decidedly non-violent movement through acts of violence. One grieving family member acknowledges the contradictory temporal logic of what they do. This violence cannot change the past, and will not bring any of the lost children back. Although there may be no reversing time, there is at least a movement into the future. And indeed, the group photographs themselves to record the moment and bind them forever in criminality toward the future. The film ends, if not concludes, with another question for the future. In the last scene, Lee Gum-ja and her daughter, who has bounced lightly through this film from one caretaker to another, face each other in an alleyway. As Lee weeps in shame and perhaps even in regret, her daughter holds her in comfort as a parent might. The voiceover narration, which has occurred intermittently throughout the film, is now confirmed to be the daughter's, but it is an older woman's voice, implying a retroactive narration of the events of the film, a telling of how things came to be from a future that the film only suggests obliquely. Old girl. The question becomes, can Lee and her daughter reconcile and move into the future together, given their separation thus far? There is the sense that all the vengeance and violence is finally over, that the wrongs of the past have been made right, and that Lee's daughter forgives her for her past. A history of vengeance, delivered in time and in violence, is closed by a pardon given by a new generation. In this way, the film opens up to the future, to possibility, as an inversion of the obsession with the past that this film, like so many others in South Korea, exhibits. Somewhat similarly, I prefer to end this talk with an opening rather than a conclusion. To recap, I've examined a number of ways that recent Korean films show an obsession with the past, in backward narratives, time travel stories, flashbacks, and in the Vengeance Trilogy, where characters seek to recover lost time. These nonlinear structures are so pervasive in South Korean cinema that their meanings seem overdetermined from the start. But I have suggested that, in their totality, these devices suggest a larger tendency, an obsession with the past and with pastness. Most specifically, I've asserted that these devices function as creative, indirect forms of historiography, presenting novel and ingenious models for connecting the past to the present. Along the way, I've been wary of connecting these nonlinear structures to any concrete relation to South Korean social history, in large part because the scholarship that does so appears to sideline the significance of affect in the films. So as a way of opening up this discussion about time in Korean cinema, I would question the desire of the film scholar. What do we want of these films? It seems that if we attend to the role of affect properly in Korean cinema, it would require that we alter an epistemological stance that we typically hold towards cinema. That is, in this stance is, we know it when we see it, right? These films seem to require that we feel them when we see them. And although the films were made in the past, our feelings about them can persist. Just watch. Thanks.